Imagine a man being sentenced to death. Then you discover he might be the most innocent and pure human being you've ever met in your life. What would you do? Would you trust the law or what your own eyes have seen? This is the story that made millions of viewers cry and became one of the greatest stories in the history of cinema. The film takes us back to 1935, to an American prison that held death row inmates. There was a long corridor, painted a pale green, that led directly to the execution room with the electric chair. Everyone who walked down that corridor knew they would never return, which is why the guards called it the Green Mile. Paul was the head guard, a fair man who tried to treat everyone with respect, even those awaiting death. He didn't see the inmates as mere numbers or criminals, but believed that a human being remains human even in the final moments of their life. On a quiet morning, the prison truck stopped in front of the iron gate. Out stepped an enormously large man, unnaturally tall, chained at his hands and feet. His name was John Coffey. Anyone seeing him for the first time thought him a monster because of his massive size, but the moment they looked into his eyes, they felt something entirely different. There was no cruelty or hatred in them, only deep fear and sorrow. John was accused of murdering 2 young girls in a horrific manner, and so he was sentenced to death. When he entered the prison, everyone expected him to be violent, but he surprised them with his profound calm and politeness in speech. That night, John asked for just one thing. He said in a faint voice, "Please, don't turn off the lights completely. I'm afraid of the dark." The guards looked at each other in astonishment. How could a man of this size be afraid of the dark like a small child? Doubt began to creep into Paul's heart, but he had no evidence at all of John's innocence. Meanwhile, there was a sadistic guard named Percy, who took pleasure in tormenting the inmates. In one incident, he causes an inmate's execution to go horribly wrong by deliberately failing to moisten the sponge used in the execution, shocking everyone present. Paul was silently suffering from a painful illness that made his days difficult, but he hadn't told anyone the extent of his suffering. One evening, while he was checking the cells, John Coffey called out to him quietly. Paul approached cautiously, and John asked him if he was in pain. Paul froze in place. He hadn't told anyone about his illness. So how did John know? John extended his enormous hand through the bars and asked Paul to hold it. Moments later, something inexplicable happened. After John Coffey reached his hand out toward him, Paul felt intense hesitation. He didn't know why this quiet inmate was so insistent on holding his hand, but he responded in the end. Within moments, Paul realized something extraordinary had happened. The pain that had plagued him for so long suddenly vanished, as if a heavy burden had been lifted from his body. He found no logical explanation for what had occurred, but he began to look at John Coffey in a completely different light. From here, the film begins to raise its central question. Could a man who appears guilty in everyone's eyes actually be innocent? And does justice always hit its mark? Paul's interest in John's behavior grows, and he notices that John carries none of the cruelty or violence, traits he'd expect from someone accused of such a serious crime. On the contrary, he treats others with gentleness and is deeply affected when he sees pain or suffering, as if people's emotions transfer directly into him. After witnessing John's extraordinary ability to heal the sick, Paul Edgecombe decides to secretly take him outside the prison to the warden's house. There, John approaches the woman, places his hands on her, and appears to draw the illness out of her body. Moments later, symbolic black smoke or insects emerge from his mouth, signifying that he has expelled the disease he absorbed into himself. The woman then wakes up completely healed, while John collapses from sheer exhaustion, having borne that pain himself. After John Coffey healed the warden's wife, something happened that completely changed the course of the story. While John was recovering from his exhaustion, he approached Paul Edgecombe and placed his hands on his face. This time he wasn't healing him. Instead, he transferred visions and memories to him that let him see the truth for himself. In these visions, Paul sees that John did not kill the 2 young girls he was accused of murdering. Rather, he had found them after they'd been attacked by the real killer and tried to save them using his healing ability, but arrived too late. When people found him, he was cradling their bodies and weeping, and they assumed he was the murderer. After John Coffey healed the warden's wife, something happened that completely changed the course of the story. While John was recovering from his exhaustion, he approached Paul Edgecombe and placed his hands on his face. This time, he wasn't healing him. Instead, he transferred visions and memories to him that let him see the truth for himself. In these visions, Paul sees that John did not kill the 2 young girls he was accused of murdering. Rather, he had found them after they'd been attacked by the real killer and tried to save them using his healing ability, but arrived too late. When people found him, he was cradling their bodies and weeping, and they assumed he was the murderer. Paul also sees that the real killer is another dangerous inmate named Wild Bill Wharton, a violent and merciless man. After these visions, Paul becomes completely convinced that John is innocent, and he's deeply shaken as he realizes the law is about to execute a man who never committed the crime. Paul and his colleagues try to find a way to save John, even offering him a chance to escape, but John refuses. He says he has grown weary of the cruelty of the world, of watching people hurt one another, and that he no longer wishes to go on living. This moment stands as one of the most powerful in the film, because it reveals that John, despite possessing extraordinary power, could not save himself from human injustice. The execution is carried out, and John leaves this life amid deep sorrow from all the guards, who realized they had executed an innocent man with a pure heart. At the film's end, we discover that Paul lives an unnaturally long life, and that the small mouse is also still alive decades later, a sign that John had passed part of his power onto both of them. Paul spends his final years wondering whether this long life is a gift or a punishment, unable to forget the good man who once walked the Green Mile toward the execution room. The Green Mile stands as one of the most powerful films in cinema history, exploring themes of justice, mercy, racism, and faith, and leaving behind a moving ending that is hard to forget.